There's simply not one Asia, nor is there one vision of the way forward. The largest, most populous continent is a dynamic and unstoppable force, but the future is unwritten. It will take clarity and cooperation to realize the continent's true potential. How people, governments, and corporations react to the challenges ahead will define the future. It is easy to a realist and still be very optimistic.
Today, the United States' focus with regards to trade with Asia is something called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The TPP, or Trans-Pacific Partnership, really would help free up more and more trading opportunities with the region.
This is Asia's time. This is Asia Rising. Asia has thousands of years of tradition and unique perspective that encourages cooperation and collaboration. ASEAN, AEC, and FTAs are modern constructs of a global economic system, but they're ideally suited to the peoples of Asia. We understand the value of building bridges and removing barriers for the benefits of all, but we also understand competition. I see the drive to succeed and the will to get ahead every day across Asia. We know how to make money. In Asia, corporate and political leaders understand that regional economic integration isn't just a feel-good philosophy. It's good business and will position the nations of ASEAN to take on the world. It's becoming apparent that Asians know how to make money.
The key force which has been driving East Asia is what I would call East Asia integration, East Asia intra-regional trade among themselves. So the tariff barriers have come down, the transport links have been coordinated, and then you have these fantastic logistics organizational firms, many of them in Hong Kong and Singapore, and they're putting together all these orders. They're interacting with the Walmarts of the world, and they're asking where all these things can be assembled, and then they're producing in China, and then they're shipping it all out. So this is a collaboration economically that the world's not seen. We've described this region as the region with the greatest spaghetti relationships. There are free trade agreements bilaterally across groups, between sub-regional groups, more than any other region in the world. And that'll continue. This is a region driven by free trade, and mainly because of the production sharing network. So I don't see anything that will stop that process. Every country in the region would like to see the barriers come down.
We would like to see more and more this common value be shared. Democracy, human rights, freedom of speech, and we are seeing that too. For example, look at Myanmar. Huge change has occurred in 2 years, and in other parts of Asia as well. You're seeing a very welcoming tendency. So I think I'm quite hopeful, and Japan's role, as I said in the outset, try to promote this free trade area of Asia Pacific as a whole, I think would be one we would like to do with the United States together as a important partner of rulemaking in this area.
Our wealth comes from trading with the rest of the world. Our wealth in 70s and 80s came from our trading relation, very strong trading relation with the United States. And it's gradually shifting away from the United States and much more intra-regional basis. In other words, our volume of trade is a lot larger. Our volume of trade with China is a lot larger than our volume of trade with Japan and the United States put together. That means that we are intra-regionally really interlocked and interdependent. Therefore, making a free trade agreement among ourselves is a key founding issue that may determine how we live as the region and the country as a whole.
ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is really a collection of 10 Asian countries. It's as diverse as Myanmar or Burma on the far west, extending eastward to Indonesia, to Philippines and Brunei. ASEAN really is an attempt by these 10 Asian nations to really come together. And really they have. But the reality is that ASEAN has to do so much more to really come together economically, culturally, and politically. One of the things that ASEAN is doing to its great credit is trying to create an ASEAN economic community. You know, in the next 2 years, these nations will really have to be thinking through, can they really work together? Can they work together politically? Can they work together culturally? Can they work together economically? ASEAN is so diverse, and that's one of the challenges, but my hope is that given the diversity of ASEAN, they'll also find great strengths in that diversity. From Vietnam, Myanmar, you know, really the whole Indochina region, ASEAN has the great potential really to drive employment, to drive labor growth for so much of the region. Free trade will be a net benefit for the people of ASEAN. It will mean growing economies, it will mean more jobs, it will mean more opportunities for products and services provided by the nations of ASEAN.
We aspire to be a community, not quite a union. A community meaning we will become one market, integrated, and rather competitive with the rest of the world, certainly with the rest of the emerging world. 600 million people, 2 trillion combined GDP, as I said, it's sizable. So that investment in one country, you can have the market of the other 9. And then we certainly would like to be competitive with the rest of the world. We want to be equitable within ourselves so that gap between and within countries will not be as wide. And that's a major task for us now, so that the richest country and the poorest country, the GDP and the per capita income will not be too wide apart. And then we want to be integrated with the world seamlessly. And that will take some effort because we are now connected with the world. We are now all exporting economies. We are now importing economies. We are very much integrated with the world. How are we going to be integrated with the world and then be protected from the uncertainties of the global community?
So, as you know well, so we will start what we call AEC, which is ASEAN Economic Community. We'll start from early 2015. And I think, so through that AEC start, in terms of logistics, much more easier to access of each countries, and also in terms of the labors, movement to the other, each countries will be easier to move to what we call neighbor countries. So I think population itself of what we call ASEAN countries will be covered around 600 million population. So we can think as a unity of 600 million population as one market.
AEC is a very good organization, and we are looking forward the AEC become positive and become truly happened. AEC will become in the future EU-type regional free zone. And I'm pursuing some of energy efficiency standard unification for AEC, which has been discussed and is in progress. But those kind of things, we expect AEC as a one united market or united region to do something together. Of course, it's very difficult compare with EU or United States because the religious is different, language is different, and the culture is totally different. Like Europe, most of them are same religion. It's a very difficult issue, but when we talk about future growth, this Southeast Asian area, ASEAN plus some countries, have a great prospect to grow. So AEC is a very good base for growing further, sound growth, and that's what I'm expecting for.
Right now, one of the challenges that ASEAN, this Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is facing is how do they deal with the big powers, China, the United States, Japan, India. You know, in many ways, ASEAN is like the proverbial grass field when two elephants play or two elephants fight. You know, ASEAN does not want to be the grass field of which the big players are fighting over. One of the challenges for ASEAN is how can they move forward in a way that really offends none of the big global players in the region?
Well, it should make Southeast Asia a stronger trading bloc, and it should make it, as a combined entity like the EU, it can be greater than the sum of its parts. But there are lots of challenges. There are cultural issues. ASEAN has proved to be a difficult collection of political and economic systems to align around common issues. So we'll have to see what happens.
The strength of ASEAN in the past is that they were united in economic objectives of prosperity. The weakness of the ASEAN group is precisely that they are so diverse. You have small countries, you have bigger countries. You have countries which have very low incomes. You have countries which are middle to high and even high incomes like a Singapore. You have countries which are aligned very much with what I call Western beliefs and cultures and values. And you have others who I would call much more regional, and some would say even much more sympathetic to the Chinese views of the region and the world. So you have this tremendous diversity. And because of this diversity, ASEAN has also tried to be what I would call relatively neutral. They've never tried to force anyone to take a position. For this past decades, for example, they've been unwilling to put a lot of pressure on Myanmar in an overt fashion. They would talk to them under the table or behind the scenes, but they would not want to come out with a big declaration saying, Myanmar, you've got to open up, you've got to reform. So they've been very careful in terms of the neutrality. Now that principle of neutrality, of impartiality, also means that ASEAN has a very difficult time dealing with contentious issues where there isn't a general uniform agreement. And many of these, what I call politically tinged or economically politically tinged issues, it's going to be very hard to get a unanimous view. So I think ASEAN does have this problem in being able to take a strong position on some of the more contentious issues. And many of these involve the role of China in the region. And that's why I think this kind of interplay is going to be stalemated for a while. The biggest issue in a broader sense is over time, will they say that they need stronger ties with the West in terms of fostering more direct relationships, or will they continue with the links they now have with countries like China or Japan and become more of this production sharing network? Now, there are risks both ways. Right now, over the last 10 years, everyone has sort of benefited from this production sharing network arrangement, and there's no particular reason for them to feel it cannot continue. However, some of the countries are beginning to say, we can't put our eggs in one basket. We're actually getting a little bit too close to relying only on China as our export market. We need to diversify direct trade relationships with Europe, the United States. However, when they start to look at that particular opportunity, they're a little bit paralyzed right now because of what's happening in Europe and what's happening in the United States. The demand is not just there. So they would like to actually diversify, but it's becoming a lot harder for them to do so, primarily because the West has stagnated so much over the last couple of years.
For the ASEAN economic community, tremendous challenges remain. Remember, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations is a creation of 10 very different nations. At some level, it comes down to domestic politics. Domestic politics remains one of the biggest challenges for a successful ASEAN economic community. You know, what makes sense for a business in Thailand might not make sense for a business in Cambodia or Indonesia. So how will ASEAN's economic community address these differences of opinions? What's right for one country in Asia is not necessarily right for another country in Asia. Economic growth and political stability are clearly linked. We've seen this in China, where political stability has really allowed the country to move forward. But you know, when it comes to growth, the real basis for growth has been countries have freed up their own people. Free markets, the private sector, they've done more to lift people out of poverty in Asia than any fancy World Bank program or ADB loan or grant. When it comes to the ASEAN region, we also have the same challenge for governments as they try and balance political stability with people demanding freer and freer economies.
It's a very tricky situation. I mean, the alliances, their political orientation, where they see their future in a political sense varies. Japan looks very closely toward the United States as its main ally. China, of course, is trying to establish a greater presence in the region more broadly. Now, Taiwan is sitting there wondering whether it's going to become relatively able to maintain its independence or whether over time it's going to become closer to the mainland China, and is wondering to what extent will the United States be helping them stay what I call as a relatively independent economy or an entity in a longer term sense. And South Korea is sitting there trying to figure out whether it's going to be pulled also closer to China, and of course its future is also lies with North Korea. Then you have the ASEAN. And why is it these ASEAN countries, which in some ways economically are not that important, why is it that they become the focal point in terms of political issues? Because this group of countries is seen as what I would call a relatively neutral group. They have multiple alliances. They're not really aligned with any particular bloc. And so both the Japans of the world, or even the United States, and certainly Korea, and certainly China, and even the Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, what they all are trying to do is to form some kind of a relationship with ASEAN as a core. And in some ways, this core of ASEAN is a balancing core. It's there to say we're neither going to be pulled in this direction or that direction. So that's why you see these political relationships, which emanated from what I call the economic links, the production sharing network, being formed. And then so you start off with the core ASEAN group, and then you have the ASEAN plus 3, ASEAN plus 5, and then a broader concept of an East Asian community. And does that go and incorporate India? Does it incorporate the United States? Does it incorporate Australia and the Pacific Islands? And some people even talking more about bringing in some of the Pacific countries in South America or Latin America. So you start from an ASEAN core and it gets wider and wider and wider. And where exactly does this relationship or this circles sort of like stop? At what point did it become more significant? And you have this APEC. The APEC is even a broader concept. And I think everyone's trying to figure out which one of these are going to be more productive. And there's a lot of politics going on here.
By and large, I think we are lucky if we continue to live in a world where the voice of reason and sound investment remains the pillar of cooperation. The big concern and worry is always that politics are not moving in tandem with the commercial world. If politics don't support economic integration, cooperation, then business can no longer play its role, and that is creating jobs, finding practical solutions, and so forth. There has been an increase in economic activities around the world, no doubt. There has also been a historically never have seen before reduction in poverty figures, largely due to private investment. It's a good thing. We should build on that, support it. What worries me currently is that we take for granted trade and investment. We don't sufficiently support multilateral approaches anymore. There's a huge trend towards bilateral, country-by-country approach. So we forget a little bit that the global marketplace is based and built upon some fundamental principles such as non-discrimination. It requires caretaking. The World Trade Organization needs empowerment, needs support. Currently, we see a big trend of bilateral treaties on investment and trade, of national definitions that are not necessarily very supportive of the multilateral agenda. So my personal hope is that we rediscover the importance of caretaking of the system that supports the global marketplace, and we invest again more in multilateral approaches.
The political issues tend to sometimes overwhelm the business issues, but I do think that overall, at the end of the day, when people can buy products cheaper at Walmart at Christmas time and can be re-employed in businesses that benefit from globalization, that the political issues recede into the background.
So our country, actually, we try to balance our country into a well-balanced country. Previously, during the past 30 years, we are more reliant on one single country like China for our survival. Politically, psychologically, financially, everything we have to rely on one country. So now our new government, our new leader try to balance everything, open up our country to everybody, including EU and the West. So by doing this, we think as a business people, they are on the right track to move to democratic way of government and society in the future.
Yes, Japan and US have long enjoyed a great economic relations and security relations. We are the most important partner in Asia Pacific. 80% of Japanese thinks affinity towards Americans, and 80% of Americans think that Japan is a trustworthy partner. This is a very special relations, and economic relations is one of the key pillar there. And we have been an important trading partner, and I hope that we can enhance it through solving existing issues we have in some areas, and also we construct a new sort of dialogue forms of such as, for example, we are talking about free trade area of Asia Pacific. FTOP is the acronym for that. That's all Asian Pacific, and one of that could be a TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. We are now consulting with Americans how we should join or not in the negotiations. These are very important tools for enhancing our relations, trade relations.
Well, American companies have been in the lead in opening up many of these markets. American companies arguably have done more to market liberalization than a whole set of generations of politicians because the power of markets and demonstrating you can create opportunities by sound investment is very convincing. Already American companies have been moving ahead with good examples. There are again and again negative headlines about supply chain issues, about labor issues. There's again and again a need to have a second look into how you source, how you partner. Do you have your environmental policies updated? Do you have a sound social inclusion policy in place? Are you really up to speed on anti-corruption? Are you part of transparency movements? So there's a continuous need for updating and refining and improving corporate policies to ensure that you're setting a truly positive example. By and large, it is true that American companies and European companies and Japanese companies have moved ahead with good examples. Their standards on average is far above local standards, and just sure they're, by their sheer presence, they're setting a good example because it's a much higher performance level on everything that a corporation is doing. But again and again, there are individual examples where there is a need for doing more.
I think that there are a number of areas where U.S.-China relations are becoming challenging. One is access for American firms into the Chinese market. A second is the cyber attacks that are happening between the U.S. and China, both sides, in different ways. A third is what happens in North Korea. And the fourth, that is very real, is the Japan-China-U.S. relationship. it's very clear that while most countries in Asia would like to find a way to balance between China and the U.S. and have good relations with both, for the Japanese that's not really an option. That's one of the reasons why Prime Minister Abe decided to embrace opening negotiations in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's a big multilateral trade agreement that the U.S. is trying to put together, which the Chinese will not be a part of. It is certainly true that anti-Japanese sentiment exists very broadly in China. It's also true that anti-Chinese sentiment is found very easily in Japan. These countries do not like each other, they don't trust each other, they don't work together well. The power balance between the two countries is also shifting very dramatically. It used to be that the Chinese really needed Japanese investment dollars. They needed Japanese technology. Well, they don't need the money anymore, investing in China is increasingly seen as a privilege, not necessarily privilege access to market, not necessarily we need your capital, otherwise we can't do things. And even Japanese technology, which is world-class, but increasingly South Korean and Taiwanese technology can be used as a substitute effectively by China. It really is a challenge between these two countries. Many Japanese businessmen are thinking that this is not a great long-term investment for them in a way that they weren't thinking even a year ago, so that's changing. And they're trying to hedge away their exposures. American corporates aren't there yet, but the Japanese are. And again, if you're in the position of Prime Minister Abe, you really see that you really have one option here, and that's a much closer relationship, security relationship, economic relationship, diplomatic relationship with the United States.
It's important for Japan and U.S. to cooperate in, for example, in energy field or other fields that are important for economic development.
Europe and the US have been two major sources of foreign direct investment into the region. In fact, 2010-2011, Europe was the first to come into ASEAN, about 22-23% of 78, 80 billion US dollars.